The first thing that strikes you when listening to PLO Lumumba is not his voice, but the truth he brings with it. He begins with a revelation so simple, yet so devastating, that it forces anyone watching to stop and think. Many African nations do not print their own ballots. In moments meant to express the will of the people, the very papers that carry those choices are produced in Germany, Greece, London, or Paris. A basic ballot, which becomes worthless the moment it is counted, often carries more security features than the money African citizens use every day. And Lumumba asks the question that hangs in the air like a warning. How did a continent lose the confidence to trust itself with something as basic as paper? For viewers in the United States, especially older Americans who understand the weight of self-governance, this hits deeply. Because ballots are not simply paper. They are symbols of trust. They represent belief in a nation's institutions, belief in its systems, and belief in the people who safeguard them. When African countries outsource this responsibility, it is not only a matter of logistics. It becomes a mirror reflecting something more painful, a loss of faith in their own structures, a fear that the results will not be respected unless another nation prints the paper that carries them. Lumumba's message becomes even more powerful when he shifts from ballots to people. He describes a continent where elections are no longer peaceful civic events, but life-threatening moments. In South Africa, citizens push migrants out of hospitals. In Kenya, communities prepare for conflict 2 years before elections even arrive. In Sudan, 2 men claim to be president. In Libya, 2 governments rule at the same time. Across the Sahel, transitions are marked not by stability, but by uncertainty. Each example paints a picture that is not exaggerated. It is real, and it is happening now. These warnings matter because they reveal something deeper than political conflict. They show how fragile trust has become, how quickly elections turn into crises, and how urgently Africa needs a different path. Lumumba's question is direct. If this is the road Africa continues on, what will happen to the generations growing up under systems that fail them repeatedly? If this message makes you pause, keep listening, because the next question strikes even deeper. Why did elections in Africa become life-threatening in the first place? To understand why PLO Lumumba speaks with such urgency, we must look at the reality he describes across the African continent. His examples are not isolated incidents. They form a pattern, a long chain of political tensions that stretch from the southern tip of Africa to the northern deserts of the Sahel. Each incident reveals the same truth. Elections, the one moment meant to unite a nation, have instead become the spark that divides it. Lumumba begins by drawing attention to South Africa, where migrants from other African nations are chased out of hospitals during times of political stress. It is a disturbing image. A mother seeking medical care can find herself forced back to the streets because an election season has turned neighbor against neighbor. Then he moves to Zimbabwe, where new groups call for carving out separate territories, a sign of how fragile national unity has become. Malawi and Tanzania struggle through similar patterns of contested elections, each cycle raising fears that the next vote will bring deeper unrest. In Kenya, ethnic tensions rise years before ballots are even printed. For older American viewers, The idea that people begin bracing for conflict 2 years in advance may feel almost unimaginable. Yet in parts of Africa, it has become routine. Families prepare not for election day, but for the violence that could follow. Lumumba highlights Sudan, where 2 men claimed the presidency, and South Sudan, where the political system fractures under the weight of competing interests. Libya operates with 2 governments. In the Sahel, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso shift toward military transitions because their inherited electoral systems repeatedly failed to produce stability. None of this, Lumumba argues, happens by accident. These modern crises are rooted in a legacy that Africa did not choose. In 1884, European powers gathered at the Berlin Conference and carved the continent into pieces without consulting the people who lived on that land. Tribes, kingdoms, and communities with long histories were sliced apart. Borders were drawn to benefit European interests, not African unity. When independence finally arrived, the new African nations inherited structures that were not designed for their success. Traditional leadership systems were weakened or dismissed. Indigenous models of governance, which often depended on consensus, negotiation, and community bonds, were overridden by imported systems that did not match African realities. From that moment on, elections in Africa were built on a foundation that could not support them. Lumumba gives example after example that reveals the cost of this inherited instability. Congo elected Patrice Lumumba in 1960. 9 months later, he was assassinated, sending the country into decades of conflict. Togo's Sylvanus Olympio was murdered in 1963. Nigeria collapsed into coups by 1967. Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania all experienced military mutinies in the mid-1960s. Uganda suffered a major coup in 1971. Each event marked the same pattern. Elections did not strengthen nations, they fractured them. Lumumba argues that the collapse of the Soviet Union accelerated this instability. With a single global power defining what democracy should look like, African nations were pushed into adopting multi-party systems and Western-style constitutions, whether or not they fit their own cultural and political landscapes. Europe continued to operate monarchies in the United Kingdom, Spain, Denmark, and Sweden, yet insisted that Africa adopt models Europe itself never abandoned. This hypocrisy, Lumumba says, shaped African politics more deeply than most citizens realize. He insists that the heart of the crisis is not voting itself, but the meaning attached to political power. For too many politicians, elections become the doorway to personal enrichment. Winning office is treated as a reward. Losing is treated as a threat. This mindset fuels violence, bribery, and the exploitation of ethnic divisions. Ordinary citizens feel trapped in a system where the cost of political competition is often paid in fear and instability. To illustrate this, Lumumba shares a story familiar to many communities. A young voter in Uganda once told him she received a bag of rice and a small envelope of money during a campaign. She took it because she needed to feed her family, even though she knew the gesture was not genuine leadership. Her story is not unique. It represents millions of Africans caught between survival and civic responsibility. Lumumba's message becomes clear. Elections in Africa do not malfunction because Africans are incapable of governing. They malfunction because the systems Africans inherited were never meant to empower them in the first place. And unless the continent confronts this legacy, each election will repeat the same painful cycle. If elections were built on a broken foundation, what moment in history pushed Africa toward the crisis we see today? The turning point in Lumumba's message arrives when he shifts from history to the emotional reality of the present. His voice steadies as he explains that the crisis in African elections did not simply appear overnight. It grew out of decades of disappointment, distrust, and leadership failures. What makes his warning so powerful is not the list of political events, but the way he connects those events to the daily lives of ordinary people. He describes how entire communities brace themselves for periods of uncertainty long before campaigns begin. Mothers plan where their children will stay in case violence erupts. Families hide their savings, fearing that riots might spill into their neighborhoods. Many stop attending public gatherings because political rallies often end in confrontation. For many viewers, especially older Americans who remember the value of civic safety, this paints a sobering picture. Elections, which should be a moment of hope, have become moments of fear. Lumumba draws attention to Uganda, where vote buying has become so normalized that motorcycles, bags of rice, and cheap clothing are used as tools to influence voters. He explains that when leaders treat elections as a marketplace rather than a sacred civic responsibility, the people lose their sense of dignity. A story he once heard from a school teacher captures the emotional weight of this system. The teacher described a local election season when parents lined up to receive small gifts from candidates. Each gift came with the unspoken message, "Your vote is worth the value of what you can carry home." The teacher said she watched elderly citizens, people who lived through decades of hardship, accept these offerings not out of loyalty, but out of survival. That moment revealed a deeper truth. When poverty mixes with politics, the people are not choosing leaders. They are negotiating with hunger. Lumumba warns that this dynamic fuels corruption, tribal manipulation, and even violence. He continues by pointing to Sudan, where two men declare themselves president, leaving citizens unsure who truly holds authority. He highlights South Sudan, where political disorder forces families into repeated cycles of displacement. In Libya, two governments claim legitimacy. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, former leaders face charges in absentia. These events are not isolated. They reflect a continent struggling with systems that do not match its cultural, historical, or economic realities. Then Lumumba reaches a critical realization. The structures left behind after independence were not designed to protect African unity. They were designed to maintain outside influence. This, he explains, is the root of electoral instability. When elections are built on frameworks that undermine trust, the people cannot feel safe participating. Leaders cling to power not because they fear losing support, but because losing power often means losing protection. The stakes become personal, not national. The emotional climax arrives when Lumumba talks about the role of women. He explains that African women, who are often the backbone of communities, avoid political spaces because those spaces have become hostile. He describes seeing women at rallies wearing jeans and running shoes because they do not know if they will have to run for safety. He says that true democracy is when a woman can attend a political gathering, dressed however she chooses, speak her mind freely, and walk home without fear. Until that day arrives, elections cannot be considered truly democratic. He also turns attention to clergy, traditional leaders, and academics, explaining that many have been compromised or intimidated into silence. Some religious leaders are pressured by politicians. Some academics fear losing their jobs if they speak truth to power. When these pillars of society weaken, dysfunction spreads. Lumumba states that Africa must revive these institutions because no nation can build trust without moral anchors. As Lumumba's message builds, it becomes clear that the crisis he describes is not only political, it is spiritual, cultural, and generational. It affects identity, dignity, and the future of millions. His conclusion in this section hits hardest when he says that Africa must reclaim its sense of purpose. Leadership must be defined not by power or wealth, but by service and responsibility. Elections must not be contests of violence, but contests of ideas. But even if Africa understands the failures of its past and present systems, what does it truly take to rebuild a model of governance that protects its people instead of harming them? As Lumumba continues, he shifts the lens from the political stage to the everyday experiences of ordinary Africans, revealing the profound civil and political consequences of a broken electoral system. He emphasizes that the instability seen during elections does not end when ballots are counted. It lingers, shaping how people live, how families make choices, and how communities relate to one another. In many parts of Africa, a child grows up watching leaders rise through intimidation rather than through ideas. A teenager hears more about clashes during campaigns than about national progress. A shopkeeper learns that election seasons are times to close early and stay cautious. These are not isolated experiences. They form a collective memory that teaches entire societies to fear the very process meant to represent their voice. Lumumba points out that impunity lies at the heart of this crisis. People who commit violence during elections rarely face consequences. Those who bribe voters often continue in office. Those who incite division walk freely. This lack of accountability undermines the belief that leadership can ever be trusted. A young farmer once told Lumumba that he no longer pays attention to debates or campaigns because he feels that no matter who wins, the people lose. His father had lived through the same cycle. His grandfather had too. 3 generations, each believing that leadership had nothing to do with service and everything to do with power. This story, Lumumba explains, is repeated across the continent. The consequences extend far beyond political frustration. Lumumba warns that when institutions weaken, society begins to fracture. Families become divided along tribal lines. Communities that once shared land and work now view each other through suspicion during election season. Fear becomes a quiet guest in every household. Women are among the most affected. Because of the hostility surrounding political gatherings, many avoid participating altogether. Lumumba describes speaking to a woman who said she would never attend a rally without wearing clothing that allowed her to run. For her, politics was not a conversation, it was a risk. This one detail reveals how deeply insecurity has penetrated civic life. He also highlights how academic institutions, which should shape national vision and challenge corruption, have been pressured into silence. Professors who question political leaders face suspension. Researchers who present uncomfortable truths are marginalized. Universities, once the engines of reform, now struggle to maintain independence. When the voices responsible for shaping future leaders become afraid to speak, a nation loses its moral compass. Traditional leaders face similar challenges. Many are pressured by political elites, offered money or projects in exchange for loyalty. Religious leaders sometimes fall into the same trap. Lumumba recounts moments when churches became political platforms, not sanctuaries of reflection. He believes this erosion of moral authority damages the public's trust more than any single political scandal. Economically, Lumumba explains, unstable elections drain national resources and discourage investment. Businesses hesitate to expand. Young people grow disillusioned and leave the country in search of stability elsewhere. A generation that should be building its homeland instead becomes a generation scattered across borders. This creates a vacuum at home, where the most talented and determined citizens are absent at critical times. When trust erodes, democracy becomes a fragile structure held together by hope rather than by design. Yet Lumumba does not speak only of pain. He insists that African societies have the strength to rebuild if they confront the truth about their systems. He calls for criminalizing bribery, restoring institutions, and teaching civic responsibility from childhood. He says that leadership must be understood as a duty, not a position of privilege. Service, not self-interest, must define public office. Only then can elections become safe spaces rather than high-stakes battles. His message grows softer but more intense when he turns toward the future. Africa, he says, must create an environment where participation is rooted in dignity. A mother must know that her daughter can walk into a political gathering wearing whatever she chooses and return home safely. A voter must trust that a ballot represents his voice, not the influence of those who paid the most. Children must be raised to believe that leadership belongs to those who serve, not those who intimidate. If rebuilding trust begins with redefining leadership, how will global powers react when African nations finally reshape the systems that were once imposed on them? When Lumumba shifts the focus from Africa's internal struggles to the perspective of the outside world, his message becomes even more striking. He explains that global powers often speak about African elections as if they are simply technical problems, but in reality, these elections are deeply tied to international interests. For the United States, political stability in Africa has always been seen through the lens of national security, trade partnerships, and strategic alliances. Washington has long understood that a stable Africa is necessary for predictable cooperation, yet it also recognizes that a fully independent Africa would challenge long-standing geopolitical arrangements. When African nations begin questioning imported political models, it raises uncomfortable questions in Western capitals. American analysts watch closely when countries like Uganda, Kenya, or the Democratic Republic of Congo experience electoral tensions, not only because of humanitarian concern, but because instability affects global markets, investment flows, and military coordination. The United States has often promoted a version of democracy that aligns with its own strategic priorities. Lumumba's critique is that Africa inherited models that benefit outside powers more than African citizens, and this is why elections often produce tension instead of unity. Europe views the situation differently, but no less strategically. Countries like the United Kingdom, France, and Belgium have long historical ties to Africa, and those ties continue to influence how European leaders respond to political developments on the continent. France watches West Africa carefully because political instability affects migration, economic interests, and regional influence. The European Union emphasizes election monitoring and governance reforms, but Lumumba argues that many of their recommendations are rooted in European experience, not African cultural realities. Even when Europe promotes transparency and civil society involvement, African citizens question whether these reforms truly serve them or whether they maintain old patterns of control. Lumumba also reminds us that global institutions like the United Nations, international banks, and election monitoring groups often play roles shaped by international politics. These organizations bring expertise, but they also bring frameworks that may not fully capture African challenges. The deeper issue is not whether outside nations intend harm, but whether Africa can define its own systems without external pressure. American and European leaders may not fully grasp how deeply Africans desire governance built from their own values instead of borrowed structures. If the world watches Africa through the lens of its own interests, what happens when African nations begin designing a political future guided only by their own people? As Lumumba concludes his message, he returns to the heart of the problem with a clarity that leaves the room silent. Africa cannot continue building its political future using systems created by those who once controlled it. The continent inherited laws, borders, and electoral structures that were never designed to protect African unity or dignity. If Africa wants stability, it must redefine leadership from the ground up. That transformation begins with values. It begins with restoring accountability, rebuilding institutions, and nurturing a generation that believes in honest service rather than personal gain. Lumumba warns that if elections continue as they are, they will keep producing fear instead of hope. But he also insists that the future is not predetermined. Africa can choose a different path if it has the courage to redesign the foundations of governance and confront the weaknesses that have allowed corruption and violence to thrive. He urges citizens to become more than observers. They must become guardians of their own political process, choosing leaders based not on tribe, religion, or gifts, but on character and conviction. He believes that true democracy can only exist when every voter understands that leadership is a position of trust, not a reward. When a mother can walk with her daughter to a political gathering without fear, when young people no longer see elections as moments of danger, and when ballots represent genuine choice rather than manipulation, then Africa will finally step into the future it deserves. Lumumba's closing challenge feels less like a lecture and more like a prayer for the continent. He says that rebuilding trust requires patience, because real political healing does not happen overnight. It may not even happen in one generation. But history always rewards nations that choose courage over comfort. He believes Africa can reclaim its political destiny the same way many nations reclaimed their cultural identity and economic direction. It starts with a single decision: to define governance from African values instead of borrowed models, to embrace service instead of fear, to build institutions that protect the weak rather than empower the powerful. If this message touches something in you, sit with it for a moment. Think of the future Africa could build if its children grew up believing that elections are tools of unity, not warnings of conflict. Think of what the continent could become if leadership returned to its rightful meaning. And ask yourself the question Lumumba leaves behind. If Africa reclaims its voice today, what will it be strong enough to reclaim tomorrow?